Joe, I'm glad to have you on the podcast. I've been
Thank
really curious about having you on because I've observed um, the efficacy of your trial law firm. So I'm really curious to hear about your experiences here.
Yeah, definitely. Like I've said in the past, right? I think the first thing you need to be successful is to be able to take risk. I think that's something that, unfortunately, is not something that a lot of lawyers are used to, right? Because most lawyers were academically successful. I mean, the people we hire are very academically successful. They went to the best, law schools, got the best grades, and they're used to the notion where if I study enough, if I really perfect the material, I will do well, right? You don't have, typically you don't get ambushed on an exam. You don't have people trying to undermine you like you do in a trial. And you don't have the kind of variables when you're going through academia as you do in trials. And so, by definition, there is always a risk factor. It could be a witness, you know, crumbles or throws you, kind of a surprise. A judge can make a surprise ruling. Opposing counsel can, like I said, ambush you, and the jury can do, the strangest things. So the first thing you have to recognize is that by definition, trials are about risk. If you're not willing to take risk, if you're not willing to go to trial because you may in fact lose, then you really can't try any cases other than the slam dunk winners, right? And a lot of those, of course, by definition, never make it into a dispute that goes to trial. And even if they do, they're probably, you probably don't need a great lawyer for that, right? Because, the facts do matter. And if it's a slam dunk, you just don't need a great advocate. So by definition, if you're a great trial lawyer, you're trying cases where there is at least some risk. And that's why you got hired. And that means you can always lose no matter how great of a job you do, no matter how well you're prepared. That is always a factor, and you have to move forward. The other thing is, and this is part of the risk profile, and I've noticed this talking to juries afterwards. I would win a case and, you know, a jury was split, 6-6, and one juror just happens to mention a fact which I didn't, and most people wouldn't think is significant, and that turns the jury. Okay, I'll tell you about another case I had. I was trying a case. I remember it was on, I think it was New Year's Eve night. We were waiting for the jury. Yes, believe it or not, the judge kept everybody there until late at the night, New Year's Eve. I was thinking, this is unbelievable. And, the jury came back late at night and said they were deadlocked, could not reach, it was required to be a unanimous verdict, couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. They had one holdout. Now, I had noticed that the other side had been kind of sitting close to where the jury was deliberating. And now I was a plaintiff at the time. Normally, in retrospect, I should have just taken a non unanimous verdict all day, right? That's what I should have done. I did not. Uh, and come to find out, I thought maybe the other side, who was willing to do a 7-1 verdict, and they were on the defense. I thought, well, normally that would be something the defendant would not agree to. They're sitting by the jury. There must be a reason. So I said no. Turns out it was 7-1 in my favor. Could have had a jury verdict in my favor. Said no. Mistrial was declared. We had to try the whole case over again. And guess what happens the next time? I lose. Unanimous verdict against me. So, you can even tell this essentially the same story to a different jury and get a different result, you know? So, like I said, I mean, there's going to be risk that is very difficult to control. there's going to be different things. You get one jury looks at it one way, another jury looks at it differently. Unfortunately, and this was in federal court, you don't get a whole lot of time in most federal courts to do a voir dire, as we say in Texas. Um, but so you may not have a great sense of what the jury is about, but it can make all the difference in the world, and it is awfully, awfully tough to predict. Even a case with the very same facts, same lawyers, same judge, everything, change of jury can change everything. Same thing with, you're trying two cases with similar facts, not the same facts, different lawyers, different juries, different locations. Well, you know, you can't just try the same case. You've got to adjust to the new facts, maybe the different locale, maybe opposing counsel, different style. We did not, and this is the physician reimbursement case, and we won the first one, lost the second.
So going back to you're talking about risk and how you said, hey, no, I wouldn't necessarily do that today. Yeah, I wouldn't make the same decision to seek a retrial today. What is it that you're doing to assess risk differently today than you did, let's say, 10 years ago?
Well, I think first of all, you can kind of let fear and paranoia get the best of you, right? Um, you sometimes, it is your initial intuition, it's like the old saying, your first intuition, on a test, is your best. And sometimes through fear or paranoia, you can overthink things, and that can be your enemy. And so, a lot of times I will go with my first intuition. I found that helpful on jury selection, voir dire as well. Sometimes with people, I mean, there's, if you do get a full voir dire, there can be cryptic comments that you can take one way or the other, right? They may have nothing to do with anything. They may actually be good for you. They could be interpreted bad for you. And sometimes, you just overthink it to death and you end up making the wrong decision. Because of just, paranoia. This person, looked at me, kind of funny, etc. And then you'll hear from somebody else, oh, don't worry about that. They treated the other lawyer the same way. So, even when you can get more data, it's not necessarily good for you. Don't let common sense and, just regular judgment, um, don't let that go, you know, uh, hang on to that and don't overthink. Don't let paranoia and fear get the best of you.
Yeah, that gets us something, what we've been talking about that I've been curious about. Uh, there's different themes about how you approach jury trials. So one theme is authenticity. So I'm sure we'll unpack that a little more about what it means to be authentic, what are the different components of it. And there's also the aspect of taking on bad facts and not explaining that away. And likewise, I'm sure you'll explain that. Uh, and I'm curious about, when it comes to say with bad facts, it seems to me that I guess, often the case, know the bad facts in advance. Maybe bad facts surface later on, but maybe often you know the bad facts in advance. And so your approach is to say, okay, I know the ways juries think about certain issues. So I need to align this bad fact with how they think about this in order to make a persuasive case that they'll relate to. So you mentioned just now when you're in the courtroom, you don't want to overthink things. And you also mentioned before that this idea that a lot of people that are your firm or other top trial lawyers, they are very academically competent, very skilled, and they're used to being right in an academic context. And of course, and that's much more controlled, right? Like you say, a test isn't just going to pull the rug underneath you. Really, that's not really typically how it's done. So that leads to the question of, well, then the thinking part of a trial lawyer's work is most of the thinking done outside the courtroom or in the courtroom? Like, how do you think about the role of thinking, strategy, legal reasoning? Like, when and where does that play out in the course of a trial lawyer's work?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me start off with just answering that last question. I think most of the thinking occurs outside of the court, right? Yeah, you're going to have to think on your feet during a court or during a trial, absolutely, positively. But I think the real thinking goes, outside of the court house before trial ever begins, right? You have to come up with a theme, a framework of your case. And, keep in mind when I say don't overthink things, what I really mean is don't overthink things for the wrong reasons, such as fear and paranoia, right? When we talk about bad facts, I think a lot of people have the view that they don't, they're afraid of the bad facts, so they don't want to talk about them, right? I've heard some people say, well, this is, we've got our talking points, they've got their talking points, and we're going to go out there and, throw them out there, and, our talking points are better than their talking points, so we should win, right? But that's not the way it works, unfortunately. The jury's going to hear the bad facts, and if you can't come up with a theme that deals with the bad facts, then you're going to lose, in my opinion, right? If the jury is going to believe a fact which contradicts your theme, then by definition, you cannot win, right? And I think sometimes we forget that. And by the way, I'll say this: a lot of what I've learned is not just trying cases, which tried over 100, but through reading, on tools of persuasion, trial lawyers in the past. Really isn't a lot of. I mean, I'll be candid. I don't know that there's a lot of new thought out there in terms of advocacy. There might be some trends. We have the reptile theory, which I could talk about later. But a lot of the great advocacy has been taught for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So a lot of what, I talk about is really plagiarizing what people in the past have talked about. And a lot of those people were plagiarizing stuff, people that came before them. But I think one of the things that you'll hear from, I think, some great trial lawyers and some great trial teachers is, find a way to make the bad fact at least work with your theme, right? So you want to talk about the bad facts. You don't want to ignore them. And that is something that people don't do because they're afraid to, right? They don't like it. It's not comfortable. So the greatest thing you can do is thinking before a trial, a way to make that bad fact work for you. That's ideal, okay? That is at the top of the pinnacle. Turn around that bad fact and make it work for you. Now, this goes a lot easier, one, if you can find a way for it to work for you, but also if you're going first, right? If you're going first and you can open first, and your first introduction, the jury's first introduction, in fact, that bad fact is how you frame it. That's an incredible advantage. And a lot of times you can do it on the defense, but it's so much easier if you're framing it for the first time for the jury to hear, right? Because if it's something the jury first hears from your mouth, because you're on the plaintiff's side, you're going first, and you make it work for your case, it doesn't sound like a weakness, right?
What's the time you did that?
I'm sorry?
What's the time you did that?
Well, I did this in, we had many years ago, we did a lot of, harassment trials, sexual harassment trials, for example. And in one case, the harasser, or the victim rather, bought the harasser an expensive gift, a few $1,000s, right? That was something that the defense couldn't wait to mention, except they went second. We went first. And, I'd asked the client, and hadn't really thought about it, but had asked the client, why did you do this? And, the client had told me, well, the harasser had given me a certain opportunity that paid me extra, a stipend, and it was worth a few $1,000s. You know, I think a lot of lawyers might have just kind of ignored that and not made that part of the case. But in this case, what I decided to do was make the gift work for us by telling the jury first that, go through all the harassment and tell the jury as part of the harassment, the harasser would do certain favors, which had a financial benefit, so basically is to pay for, certain sexual or romantic favors, right? And as part of that, I said that, this was so unwelcome that the victim actually went out right after this happened and bought an expensive gift for the harasser, costing about the same amount of money to say to the harasser, we are even. I don't owe you anything. You can't use this against me. So you can imagine when the other side gets up there and tries to use that fact, it has much less effect, if any, than it would have if we had not mentioned it. Now, we had a lot of other things to mention, of course. There was a lot of good evidence of harassment, which certainly helped, right? And so, in the context of all of that, we were able to make that work and win. But you can't do that, like I said. You can't ignore something that the other side is going to, basically try to bludgeon you with, by simply ignoring it. And I've heard lawyers say, well, that's their issue, okay? We shouldn't be talking about their issue. Going back to the talking points thing, we got to talk about our talking points. Never talk about their talking points. Does not work that way. Maybe it works that way in a debate. It does not work that way in trials.
It's interesting because I think another theme that I'm starting to pick up on is fear. So the emotional game of trial work. And so fear of loss is what leads to, you'd shared before this, there's any number of trial lawyers who like to say, hey, I've never lost a trial. Well, that's because you're really being very select about the matters you take to trial. And it shows that you're not really taking the risks that you should be taking on, right? So it's kind of like with Bernie Madoff. His returns were very stable month over month, and people who had a lot of experience in finance said, "Hey, that's not how returns work. Like just that's not real." So fear maybe is what leaves people. Fear of loss is what leads to do that. Fear of looking like you don't know what you're doing might lead people to do that. They can't take a punch. So another theme that you've shared that I'm hoping we'll talk a little more about is authenticity. And being authentic to jurors, because juries, our legal system is that fact finders are assessed credibility, and so we have this intuition that if you take a handful of people and pool their judgment, they're good at sizing up credibility in people. It's just something intuitive, like you were saying, that you use when you're sizing up jury's reactions. So it strikes me there might be a connection between fear, emotions, and authenticity. So if you are being authentic in how you present yourself, how you present your client, you're way less likely to act out of fear because you're centered and you're balanced. I wonder, is that a connection that you've drawn?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, right, the ability to be authentic is linked to having less fear, right? I think a lot of, for example, when I was a young lawyer, I couldn't really be authentic because I was too afraid that if I was authentic, I would look like an idiot, right? And so I would mimic the styles of other people who looked like they knew what they were doing. They were great trial lawyers. So I just adopted their style because I didn't know, for example, that if I kind of let the jury see who I was, that, they might think, well, who is this, idiot? And, what's interesting about this is, it kind of goes back to the old, you know, textbooks on advocacy, right? I mean, there is, Plato's ethos, logos, and pathos. Well, everybody likes to talk about pathos and logos, emotional appeal and logical appeal. Ethos is where the authenticity comes in a lot of times. I mean, it's not just that. Ethos is the credibility of the speaker, meaning, I know what I'm talking about, but it is also authenticity. If I look like I am willing to, be transparent, and, what you see is what you get, that does build credibility, right? If I don't trust the speaker, I may think they know a lot, but I don't really trust them to be honest, then you don't really have that ethos. So you really want to build up ethos through showing you know what you're talking about, you know your facts, you are prepared, you're a master of the case, you're a master of the rules of evidence, so you look like you know what you're doing there, but also that you are authentic, that what the jury sees is the real you, that you can be trusted to tell the truth. But you can't do that unless the jury thinks you're real. Because the one thing that a jury can sniff out probably more than anything else is whether you're being a phony or not. And they'll forgive just about anything. You could be a jerk. You could be whatever you want to be, whatever you are, right? Imperfect, as we all are. But if you're phony, that's the one thing they won't forgive. They'll forgive being a jerk, because that's human. But they just hate people who are fakes. And so to build up any credibility, you have to be authentic. To be authentic, you have to be willing to take the risk and be unafraid to show the jury who you are. Understanding that, they may not like certain things, but they will forgive just about anything other than not being authentic.
To the extent these are trade-offs, let's say there's sincerity with being very polished, having tight answers for everything, well rehearsed, whatever. Why is it that sincerity beats out polish?
Because I don't think juries care about polish, right?
But why is that?
Because ultimately, I think jurors take their jobs very seriously, right? I mean, I think jurors, look, this is not something that most jurors do every day. This is probably the most direct interaction that a lot of jurors have with their government. They're walking into this very formal courthouse. They've got a judge in a black robe, people, advocating for their clients in, suits. They're dealing with a bailiff. They've probably gone through the jury assembly room, wherever that is. And then they get these admonitions from God, the judge, as to what they're going to do. And I think they come in there really wanting to reach the right result under the law as they are given. So they're not really there, to pick out who's more polished or anything like that. They're there to get to the bottom of the truth under the law and, get the answers right on the jury charge. So they're trying to figure out, what the truth is, and they will ignore a lot of different styles in order to get the result that they think is the right result. I truly believe that. I mean, like I said, if you try enough cases, I think you will be more and more impressed about, number one, how smart a collective group of individuals is, known as a jury, but also, how much they want to get it right. And so, this is different than picking out, well, this is the lawyer that I would hire, right? Versus, well, they're a great lawyer, but they have bad facts, right? I mean, I've heard that before, and when I lost, sometimes I would hear that too. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I wasn't that great of a lawyer after all.
So with you talked about, when you're starting out, there was trial lawyers you're modeling after and emulating their style. it was a little too far for you. It was just like, okay, this really isn't how I am, and you discovered over time how you are. Can you describe your style today, and then an inflection point where you really had a discovery about yourself in that way to say, oh, maybe it was a single trial, maybe some other kind of moment that there was a before and after. Then after that, like, okay, I'm a little bit different now, and I'm a little more authentic to who I am.
Well, I think there's a lot of things, Number one, I'm not, my view is I'm not as polished as, some speakers are. I'm probably, on the spectrum in terms of having ADD, and that will come out, but, like I said, part of it is just not being afraid. It's going to come out probably no matter what. But as long as, jury senses that, hey, I'm, kind of comfortable with who I am, I'm not trying to hide it. Um, you know, that will mean, they're going to see all of that. Plus, you're spontaneous. You're not constantly trying to calculate your words. Maybe you're a little bit more, and I hate to use this phrase, but I think you'll know what I mean, shooting from the hip almost, because it seems real, as opposed to scripted. And so, even the clothes I wear, I would, dress rather formally, and, blue suit, navy blue suit, dark gray suit, boring blue or red tie. And, but that's not how I dress typically, today I've got some attempt at Christmas gear on. I'm not sure how Christmassy I am, but, that's normally the way I would dress. So everything I've approached, um, is like that. My interactions with my staff is like my interactions in the office, right? I don't treat them any differently in front of the jury than I treat them here. Um, and you build a team of, where the team sees that you're being authentic with the jury. It helps other people, be authentic as well. So I think it's just, let go of all the fear about, trying to be somebody else. Be yourself. You're going to have flaws. I have flaws. I found most jurors don't care.
Was there a moment, was there a trial or something like that that really helped you discover authenticity for yourself?
Well, you know, um, I think what it was, and this is a little bit of, kind of circuitous reasoning. Um, but I think what kind of got me off of it was, I was trying cases and winning them with kind of a very formal style. But they were rather easy cases. I didn't know it at the time, but I remember arguing to a jury for, this is an insurance, defense case early in my career. And, I remember arguing to a jury that they should award, a small amount of damages. And they came back and awarded less than what I told them. Okay. And I thought to myself, I wasn't, apparently, I've been winning these cases, but it's not based upon my credibility, right? They don't even believe me when I say you should award more to the plaintiff than they actually awarded. And I asked them afterwards, and they were like, yeah, you just didn't seem like you wanted to call it like it was, but we saw the way it was, and we didn't think this plaintiff deserved hardly anything. And we figured, you were just trying to be nice. I was kind of like, wow, okay. And that's kind of the moment where I was realized, look, they're going to see through my attempt to be somebody else, right? And even though I think this is working because I've been mimicking the style, it's, and I had to face the sad fact of, well, these cases, of course, I was an inexperienced lawyer at the time. I was, trying cases at a very low hourly rate, and I was winning, but I think I was winning because these are closer to the slam dunk cases. I just didn't realize it. And then when I, like I said, after that moment, I, loosened up a lot, uh, you know, on those types of cases, kept winning because they were still slam dunks. And that gave me the confidence to realize I'm not really going to jet it, I'm not really not going to hurt myself by being authentic. And then when it comes to, much harder cases, it was clearly working much better because I would see others, what the other side would do. And, it was very tough for them when they weren't authentic, even when they had better facts. Some of the hardest lawyers that I've tried cases against, you know, um, and I've got, one lawyer that tried a case against, right up to about the verdict, and we settled it. But I will tell you, you know, local lawyer in town named John Kim, I mean, he is, number one, very, very, very authentic. But man, is he just off the wall. And, you know, jurors love it. They do. It is, it is pretty zany. He wears shoes. I'm not even sure I can call them shoes to court. You know, they're some version of a colorful slipper. He is funny and irascible at the same time. But he is as far out there as you will probably see with most lawyers. But again, that kind of, radical authenticity is so effective, it almost doesn't matter how far out there you are, as long as that's you. And that is him.
Mhm. Can we go back to understanding? So I guess something else that's interesting is how you think about juries. And so I'm hearing a lot of respect you have for juries. And it seems to me that I've observed this pattern in several different areas in the practice of law. When someone doesn't take something, some counterparty or some agent in this, lawyers are agents, there's different kinds of agents. When people don't take these kinds of players seriously and then they get poor outcomes, they attribute that not to themselves but to those agents or other players. Say, oh well, those players don't know what they're doing, and so they're of course I'm getting bad outcomes. So I think you hear this from I've heard this from patent lawyers. Juries, patent trials are often tried before juries when they involve damages. They do, and so you hear certain lawyers who speak not very highly of juries and what they can understand from a patent case. And it seems to me that if you take a jury seriously, if you take a counterparty seriously, whoever, you're more likely to get better outcomes, even if you're in some sense adverse or there's a conflict of interest. With principal agent, there's a conflict of interest. So it seems to me that you get good outcomes if you're taking these other actors seriously, and get poor outcomes, and you don't learn from them because you keep on saying, oh, they don't know what they're doing. So I don't know, is that a pattern that you observe? Because that's what I'm hearing about how the takeaways maybe other lawyers have had from similar circumstances.
Well, absolutely. I think you have to respect the jury's ability, and like I said, it never fails to surprise me. The problem is there's say it's a 12 person jury as we commonly have in state court. During the trial, of course, they can't say a lot, right? They can't say anything most of the time. So, they're kind of 12 blank people. And you just kind of sense that they're just literally potted plants, listen, maybe listening, maybe not. Some of them are sleeping. And so it's easy to kind of get, or fail to appreciate the fact that, yeah, maybe one of them is sleeping, and the rest are just stone silent, acting like they don't care at all. But when you're done and you talk to the jury afterwards, you find out they picked up on so many things, it's incredible amount of things. And, it's so much so that I actually, even when I'm plaintiff, I don't like sitting next to the jury. And I don't like sitting next to the jury because, like I said, they notice everything, and they particularly notice everything when you're sitting right by them. And it is very hard in a trial not to keep a complete poker face, particularly for my clients. It's, relatively easy for me and the lawyers, but my clients, it's really hard when they know they have personal knowledge oftentimes of, what's going on. They have a lot of stake, a lot of emotion behind it. And juries can hate some of those reactions, and they will notice. They'll notice if your co-counsel is furiously scribbling stuff to you while you're examining a witness, and passing you furious notes, acting, kind of desperate, or something like that. I mean, they just notice an incredible amount of things, and it never fails to impress me. Now, having said that, yeah. I think the lawyer's natural reaction upon losing a case is to say every time, oh, the jury didn't get it, right? Jury didn't get it. Now, what I've learned is that, number one, if over time, I have learned, even in cases where I lost and I thought jury didn't get it, the more I think, even sometimes it takes years, I realize where the jury was coming from. I realize that there were, the other side had a compelling story that I was just drinking too much of the Kool-Aid to see. But after the emotion and everything like that wears off, it's easier to see. The second thing is, jurors can look at things, smart people can look at things completely differently, right? And so that's why, I can try the same case twice and get a different outcome, both with smart juries. Because, in a lot of close cases, people look at things differently. I mean, look at society around us, and you will see how even smart people can look at the same thing very differently. It's just a difference of perspective, maybe a difference in, their history, their background, you know, um, what they've done for work. I mean, if you're arguing, a commercial case to somebody that has felt like they've been victimized by people that have breached contracts in their business, they're going to bring that background. They're not stupid, but they're going to bring that background. So you have to understand people with different backgrounds, or even people sometimes with similar backgrounds, but just have a different perspective. And it's not because they're dumb. Um, it's not because they're unintelligent. They just look at it differently. Smart people can look at the same facts differently. Okay. And it's not because they didn't get it. So, with those two things, I've been able to account, frankly, for virtually every jury verdict, good and bad, that I've seen. So most of them I've won, fortunately, but even the ones that I've lost, I've been able to see how they got there with the passage of time.
Mhm. With juries, you mentioned that there's patterns of worldview, beliefs that they have that you have to account for when you are presenting your story, when you're presenting facts. And if your fact doesn't align with one of those theses, principles, heuristics that they have, you're out of luck. You just got to frame things in a way that's beneficial to their perspective and lens. There's patterns of these, and so you've done work on both plaintiff and defense side. You mentioned, say corporations. There's a view that about a pattern of view that about the reasons why corporations do things or how they operate. Can you talk about some of the patterns you've observed um, from juries?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, persuasive ability, I mean, the ability to move somebody from point A to point B is actually much harder than most lawyers think it is, right? If you think about the worldview of a lot of people, and you think about, for example, the political world, no matter which side you're on, right? If you think about how easy it would be able to take somebody on the other side of the political spectrum and move them onto your side, you realize, or how hard it would be to move you to the other side of the political spectrum, you realize, certain things are just hard to move people on. Now, most trials aren't the political world, but if there is an entrenched worldview, you're far better off trying to convince a juror of something they already believe, i.e., get your theme to fit into their view, than it is to convince them that their view is wrong to start off with. So when it comes to corporations, there is a worldview, particularly after COVID, right? I mean, I think it probably existed to some extent among certain people, but after COVID, the view that corporations are not necessarily benevolent has skyrocketed. And what all jurors believe is that they are, and not all jurors, but a lot of jurors believe, is they are motivated solely by profit. And if you're trying to argue that your jury, your corporation, did things because it was the right thing to do, it oftentimes, especially with big companies, right? The smaller the company, the more credibility it can have, or the more sympathy it can have. But you're far better off trying to show that the company acted legally and in harmony with its profit interests, and not to hide that, for example, because there are some cases where the company's profit motive, and if the company acted in accordance with this profit motive, actually demonstrates that they didn't act illegally, right? Because sometimes, for example, you have to prove a certain motive for the company where their profit motive would not be consistent with that motive. Get behind that, right? Don't have to worry about the fact that a juror is going to think that, your corporation is all about the money, because many times that's what they already believe anyway. So you might as well make that work for you. I think it's very difficult to try to convince a jury that the corporation doesn't. The second thing is, especially with bigger corporations, they believe they are far more organized than they actually are, right? I mean, after representing many corporations, even the biggest corporations, you will find that they're not always, perfectly functioning organizations. They're not always the well-oiled machine, and oftentimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. You think they would have perfect documentation on everything. They don't. However, jurors think that they do. They think that there's going to be, if something important happened, there will be documentation. Um, and so that can be helpful. It can be harmful, but it's a reality. Jurors think that they're far more organized and documenting everything than they actually do. And then, now if the juror has worked for a big corporation, a lot of times they will see that and recognize that because they've experienced it. But for a lot of jurors that haven't, especially younger jurors, that may have not had a lot of time in the workplace, not a lot of time with corporate America, I think they have, views that, you know, jurors or perhaps, or corporations rather, are, you know, um, very, very well run organizations. And even if they are well run, no corporation is perfect.
What case, what trial outcome made you the most emotional? Happy, sad, angry, any of it?
Well, first of all, I think anytime you get the opportunity to take your case to a jury, generally speaking, that should be a great moment, right? Because yeah, I mean, there'll be a winner or loser or somebody that, maybe, or maybe both sides won't be thrilled with the result. But the one thing you can say is, they got their day in court, right? And, I will tell you, I've had some cases where, the client lost, but they felt good about the result, in the sense, not the result that the jury gave, but the sense that they got their day in court, they were heard. Because a lot of times when you settle cases, you don't really know what the outcome would have been. And there's always this kind of nagging doubt about what the real outcome would have been. Now, of course, the real outcome can be highly variable, as I mentioned before, but at least you would have an outcome. With a jury trial, there is never that doubt, right? So, from my point of view, I think it's always, um, a good moment in time when you are trying a case, and I think a lot of clients want that, right? A lot of clients want to go to trial. Now, sometimes, especially, with larger companies, they just don't. They're very risk averse, and they don't want to take that risk. That's absolutely, true. Um, and if they do go to court, they are, on edge. They do get an adverse impact, or an adverse result. Then, yeah, I mean, they can be unhappy with it. But my experience is a good many appreciate the fact that they got their case to trial, even when they lose. And for those people, and I try to talk to them about this, for those people that may seem, particularly keen on trying a case, I think the lawyer's job is to educate them on what we all know, which is what we've talked about, which is there is risk, right? And if you do that, I think you have a much better chance of having a client happy, with the outcome, even if it's a negative outcome. If you haven't done that and you've kind of promised them a bed of roses and you get a bad result, yeah, you're gonna have a problem.
What about for you though? What trial got you the most emotional gratification, anger, any of it?
Um, I'm always on edge when a jury comes back. And, the one thing I will tell you is even cases that might seem the most mundane, somebody cares about the outcome a lot. But even if that weren't true, which it virtually, is every time, I care, right? I'm on edge every single time. And so, to be perfectly blunt, picking out one or two cases is somewhat difficult because, um, I won't say, angry. Don't know that I've ever had that emotion. Um, but when there is a negative result, yeah, I mean, there is at least disappointment, sadness every time there is a negative outcome. And then, of course, when you win, you're almost always elated. If I had to pick out a case, I guess there's a recency bias, so I'll pick one that was within the last, 3 years. Um, we did a breach of contract case for a large physician group in town, against, a hospital where the practice group was operating, and, basically the hospital had, our contention was in a contract promise that they wouldn't set up competing facilities that did the same kind of surgery. There was a dispute about that. Um, but this was a large group of physicians that, candidly had felt, because, they were economically, doctors do well. These doctors, did well, but economically, they were definitely the small player with the least amount of leverage vis-a-vis this large hospital group. So they felt that they had been taken advantage of for years, by the hospital. So there was a lot of emotion there, right? And when we were able to get a great outcome, I think it was the right outcome. It was the right outcome we believed under the contract. But you know, um, the sense of joy and satisfaction was immense. And I think what distinguishes this perhaps from other cases is number one, the number of clients that were impacted because it was a large physician group, but also we had a great trial team. And that's what made it a tremendous experience throughout the whole process. We had somebody who was running the case, one of my colleagues, Paul Turkovich, who had done, just an incredible job in terms of working up the case, and, we had, another partner of mine, Kyle Pelker, did an amazing job. We had an amazing appellate lawyer, Kelsey White. And, we had a young associate, Marina Sanchez, and, legal assistants did an amazing job. I wouldn't be here saying, hey, we got a great result had it not been for the efforts of everybody. And we had a great time doing it. So working with a great team, working with a large group, a great group, as a client, that probably made it, the one, if I had to point one out, that would probably be it.
And you mentioned some, more junior lawyers and teams. Final question for you. For lawyers that are at a firm like yours that are getting great trial work, there's a number of other great boutiques that do trial work in Houston and elsewhere. And so they're getting great hands-on experience. Those are conditions in their favor that they're setting themselves up well for their career. What is the biggest mistake those lawyers make while they're going down that?
Well, I think, when we talk about risk, I think what stops a lot of lawyers, especially young lawyers, in terms of trying cases, is the fear of the impact it'll have on them if they lose. And so the number one thing you ought to be thinking about is being part of a group, going to a firm where there's no shame in losing. And I think at our firm, I think we've built a culture where, you come back the next day from trial and everybody's proud that you did the good fight, right? We've all lost cases. So nobody takes it as a badge of dishonor. When you're willing to fight and you work very hard, but you get an adverse outcome, right? That's going to happen. And we as a firm are supportive of everybody that goes through the fight, win or lose. And I think if you want to be a trial lawyer, you really, and you want to get the right training and experience to be a trial lawyer, it's got to start with the culture, and it's got to be a culture that is willing to let young lawyers, try cases and lose, right? And I think we do both. I mentioned that case we have for the physician group. I mentioned, for example, some partners, but also associates like Karina, my partner, uh, Kyle and Paul Turkovich, were associates at the time. And, Karina was a particularly junior associate. All of them had speaking roles during trial. All of them took witnesses during trial. And I think it's very important. And I think it really helped our team win the case when the jury got to see, not just a well functioning trial team, but a group of people that really enjoyed working together and had confidence in each other, confidence to the point where we had obviously, younger, um, so you would think less experienced lawyers that were getting trial experience. And it worked wonderfully. So, you want to go to that environment where the firm has the confidence in the younger lawyers to try cases because they've given the training that they need to go out and get real responsibility, but also is willing to allow those lawyers to take risks because you have to become a trial lawyer.
Do we have time for a bonus question?
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned books on persuasion. You mentioned studying trial lawyers. You said, hey, not much changes, but there's a canon that you can tap into. What's an underrated book on persuasion, and how do you study trial lawyers of the past?
Well, I can tell you some books. I'll give you the authors, right? Because I think you can pick out a number of different books by these authors. I'll start with one that might be the most obscure. And he was a judge, I believe, in New Jersey, named Herb Stern. Um, Maybe a little bit unorthodox, perhaps, but that was probably the one that had the biggest impact on me as a young trial lawyer, and I think it can be extraordinarily valuable. Some of the things that he said, I think, have stayed with me. I've encouraged other lawyers to read his books. Somebody even further back, Mo Levine, um, great advocate. Read everything you can from him. Jerry Spence, another tremendous advocate. We talk about authenticity. This is a guy that wore, kind of hardcore Western gear, and because that's who he was. But he had a trial lawyer school. I didn't go to it, but people that went to it rave about it. But if you can read something from him, there are many others. Now we have the new reptile theory. We have books, by Keenan and Ball. I think they're great books, especially if you're on the plaintiff side. And so, yeah, I mean, then you can go back to, again, the Greek philosophers talking about pathos, logos, and ethos, right? They've got a lot of ancient books on advocacy. You can also read books on, famous trials, and, you know, see what the lawyers did in those cases. And I remember, Dick Miller, who was the senior name partner of the first firm that I worked for, tremendous trial lawyer. Tried the Pennzoil Texaco case, by the way, for Texaco. And to talk about, taking a loss, he lost 11 billion, which in the 80s was a lot of money. you know, and came into the office the next day and said, well, just another day at the office, and got back on the saddle and worked on his next case, continued to try cases after that. Great lawyer. But, sometimes great lawyers lose, like he did in that case. So, he would read, for example, these Queen's Bench old British trials and talk about how that really helped him. So yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. And if you want to be a great trial lawyer, I think you want to read as many of these types of books as you can, because outside of actually going to trial yourself, This is some of the most helpful stuff there is.
Well, this episode was some of the most helpful stuff there is. This is some really great insights here, Joe.
Well, thank you, Karam. Always a pleasure.